Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for a conversation about the CIPR's recent PR population report that was put out a few weeks ago. We'll be, if you haven't already had a chance to look at the report, we would encourage you, of course, to do so afterwards. But if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, this is a great way to introduce you to some of the data that we found. The report is made up of using ONS census data from the 2021 census, and we were able to provide a conclusive snapshot of the size and demographics and makeup of the PR population in England and Wales. What does this tell us about the profession? How much can we really take from the findings, and what does it suggest about our future? And I'm very pleased to say that we are joined by the report researcher and author, Ben Verinder. Thank you for joining us today, Ben. Ben's going to be giving us a little introduction to the significance of the census data and some of the work that he did to capture it and put it into report form. I then have a few questions that I will be posing to Ben. As you can see, we're a fairly sort of small and intimate group today. So what I will ask is, please do feel free to drop any questions that you have into the chat. We'll get to those at the end. But also, if anyone during the chat, I'm sure Ben will be fine, excuse me, taking questions during the chat. So if there's anything that Ben says, or you just need qualification on that, or you would like some further information, pop your hand up. And if I see it, I will get to you and you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. But as I say, we'll get to some questions at the end. Ben, you should have sharing rights. So what I will do is hand over to you, and we'll get some questions very shortly.
Thanks. Cheers, John. Hello, everybody. This is a select, but a small but extremely select group in the sense that it'd be great. I'm looking forward to talking you through this, but also talking with you about it rather than talking to you about it. So I'm going to give you a very short overview of the main findings, the background to the research. John's going to ask me a few supplementary questions, and then I would be hugely keen on individuals. Let's all get sort of essentially getting our videos on, and you ask me questions as we go, and I can see if I can answer them. And I'm really interested in your views about the utility of this data, your views on it, what you think the implications are, etc. So this is a kind of an expert forum on the data, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you rather than at you about it. So again, for between about 5 and 7 minutes, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the report. Can you see my slides? Yeah? Yeah,
we can see those, Ben, thanks.
Great, thank you. So, just a quick flyby, really. I'm going to the extent that I'm actually going to put my timer on and make sure that I don't go beyond my time on this one. Stopwatch, there we go. So, quick background. I have a ridiculously nerdy interest in the population of PR practitioners. Just to give you a little bit of background to myself, I have a background in, I was actually a tabloid journalist and a radio journalist, and then international public relations, and then an in-house communications director for a large membership association. And part of my work was to work with the Office for National Statistics in disseminating data related to skills and education around the UK. And I really enjoyed it, and I got a lot out of it, and I thought it was hugely useful for my members at the time. And so I brought some of that interest into my work with Chalkstream. We're a specialist research agency. We do quite a lot of research around membership associations and industries and professions. And this is a series of studies that started in 2016 when we started looking at the Office for National Statistics data for a thing called the Annual Population Survey, which I'll talk you through a bit more detail later. And we ran those studies for 3 years, looking at different trends across those data in relation to PR practitioners as identified by what are called standard occupational classifications. So these little codes you find in ONS data. And we're really interested in the codes for people who classify themselves as public relations practitioners. There are the 2 codes. There's one that is related what's called professionals. So they're people at a level up to a sort of head of PR, and then directors. And I can talk you through that in more detail later. This project was, as John mentioned, looking at census data for the data that came out when we all did the census. About 97% of us in March the 21st in 2021 undertook the census. There are some challenges with that census because it was right at the back end of COVID and the pandemic. So again, we can talk a little bit more about that later. And there's another study, and what the author of that study, which is on the call, which is great. So we can ask him about it, which is Stephen Waddington, who undertook a really interesting and useful study on looking at PR practitioners as identified by people who registered themselves as being within the PR industry on LinkedIn. And we'll talk later about the results of that compared to the census study. But just to give you a quick overview of the results of our latest study. So we see, in terms of ethnicity, all of the studies, all the literature is pretty consistent in terms of PR practitioner ethnicity and the ethnic group that they classify themselves as in different studies. They range really from, I think the lowest on the APS was 86.7 classified as of white ethnicity. And then there have been, some of the APS studies had a figure of 91%. The State of the Profession survey and the CIPR wavers between about 86 and 92. But again, it's always at that range. This, because it's the census, I would recommend is the definitive proportion in terms of the data here. Again, I'll talk about why it's so reliable, but essentially it's the census. It's everybody. It's a survey of 63,563 people. So it's the biggest survey of PR practitioners in the world, actually. I don't think anybody's ever studied this across their own countries. I think it's a first, but I might be wrong. Problems with gender, I'm afraid, in relation to, never mind, diversity of other types, in that we see that we've got a majority of practitioners are female, but that, as Stephen wrote about really eloquently in a LinkedIn post recently, that reverses when we get to senior level and we get the majority of practitioners at male, and we can talk about the reasons behind that later. About 30% are in the director group and 70% in the professional group. And it's a young profession, about 45%, 16 to 34. What's fascinating is that is not the case for CIPR membership. I've been able to have a look at the CIPR membership stats and do some analysis. And CIPR membership, for instance, is older, quite considerably older. And what that tells us is that early career professionals are perhaps not being invested in terms of membership development as they might otherwise be. Nationality. So what we've not looked at this time is a shift between EU practitioners in 2011, for instance, the last census, and this one in 2021. So I think one of the really useful pieces of research that other researchers might want to look at is the impact of Brexit and its forces, and how that impacted the passports of different people in PR. The 8% running a small business and self-employed is really ridiculously consistent with the State of the Profession survey and the proportion of independent practitioners as identified, or small business owners as identified in that study. So that's interesting that the CIPR is kind of representative of that basis. We've got some health indicators in the census. Interestingly enough, the APS has the annual population survey, which is a different study. That has indicators about happiness as well. We're generally quite a happy bunch, but again, I think there's some further study that we looked at there. The data for travel to work is completely unique in relation to census data because it was the pandemic. So to give you an example, in the APS study, which also has questions about travel to work, 18% of people travelled to work, work from home. Whereas in this study, 81%, if I remember rightly, were working from home. So we've got a major shift in how we are. The census even includes stuff like how many second homes we have. So how many of us have a second home? And that's 7% of us, which is interesting. Just like society at large, we've got a decline in the religiosity of PR practitioners. Pretty straight line, actually, over time. And the decline in whether we believe in God, a God, or one or more gods is essentially consistent with a general public. So we know more. we're no more atheist than a general public. And it's interesting to see that actually we are the older group of professionals or directors is more likely to be married, and that's reflecting some wider social and economic trends in relation to delays of getting married and proportions of us who are getting married. Older and the younger group are essentially, well, the older you are, up to a certain point, the more hours you're likely to work. But again, that's a bit of a crude headline. We can talk about that a bit more later. More diversity in the younger group and the less senior group than there is in terms of ethnicity than there is in the older/more senior group. There is a pretty straight overlap, by the way, between age and seniority, which is a challenge in and of itself. Oh, not 81%. I was wrong. Sorry, 84% were working from home. 84% born in the UK. And again, there's some interesting data within the detail. I'd commend you to look at the report in more detail in relation to where we were all born and the kind of passports we carry. And 8% of us have a disability. And that's really interesting, I think, in relation to, for instance, the purveyors and organisers of public relations events. And I wonder whether we're taking into account that almost 1 in 10 of us has a registered disability. And there were some interesting stats as well about long-term unemployment within public relations, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of this slide. And I think that speaks to the re-employment opportunities afforded to practitioners, which might not be as extensive as they should be. I'll sort of leave the rest of this here. There's information on qualification level, highest qualification, and whether we've got degrees or not, which again I think is really useful, and working hours, and huge amount of other data and additional data, which I sort of commend to you. In terms of further research, so this is my plea, really. This is my pitch to you as potential researchers and people who might be interested in. What we haven't looked at, because this was a scrap, I mean, I take my hat off to CIPR. This was a project that they very kindly sponsored, and it was essentially delivered pretty much at cost. To reflect personal interest, but it's there's loads more that we could do, but I don't think, to be fair to the CIPR, that the CIPR should do it all, really. So I think that there's opportunities in relation to looking at in the industries in which practitioners operate. So there is no code in the ONS data, unfortunately, for PR as an industry, which poses all sorts of problems. And that's why we adopted the methodology we did. But you can look at the different industries. So if you're a PR practitioner in aviation, for instance, so that's one thing to do. We only looked at England and Wales here because the data was only available at the time for England and Wales. So there is a job to be done in looking at Scotland and Northern Ireland. There's a really great opportunity to compare against other industries and run reports like other industries. And one thing we haven't done is do a direct comparison with the 2011 census results as well. So again, something else I think that would be a real opportunity. So I'll stop there. John's going to ask me a few questions, and then we'll crack on to more broader questions from everybody. Hope that gives you an overview of the kind of stuff in the report if you've not been able to read it yet.
Thank you, Ben. Perfect. I should probably do a little plug here for the CIPR's research fund, which is currently live and open for applications at the moment. Should anyone feel the need to delve much further into some of those, or perhaps even other areas that Ben has raised or that's raised within the reports, the research fund is available to apply for funding to conduct such research. Ben, thank you very much for that good overview. You described this as the sort of the sort of biggest survey and study into public relations practitioners globally, potentially. In fact, we at the CIPR described the report as, and I quote, the most accurate and comprehensive study to date of the public relations profession. But, and this is the big caveat here, the report does include a number of caveats, a couple of which you've mentioned: the fact that it's England and Wales only, the fact that their data was captured perhaps towards the sort of tail end of the pandemic. So when people are looking at and interpreting this data, what are those sort of things that they need to consider when analysing it? And how accurate is the report in telling us a story about the profession?
Right, great question. So I think I missed a little bit. So you were asking about risks in interpretation there, John. I just missed you for a second. Yeah. So yeah, beyond the stuff that I said about England and Wales, if you are looking at it, one thing to bear in mind, it's quite considerable, is whether it missed people that were registered as in furlough. Essentially, the ONS cannot tell us that. So there's a from the APS studies we did and Stephen's study on the LinkedIn, there's a bit of a difference in population, so a decrease in population. So I wouldn't, and I think the only way that that's best explained, or the best explanation for that, is that people weren't registered as being active practitioners because they were under furlough. Now, what that means is that that bit of population, that rump of population has been lost, but that, if I'm blunt, still doesn't, so it means, you know, there's a health warning on the overall population numbers, but that doesn't mean that it's not hugely useful in terms of proportions, because it's still a survey of 63,000 people. And it was also undertaken by the ONS, so they're not allowed to give me data. So this is all ONS data. They're not allowed to give me data that is problematic. So you know, our job here was essentially getting their data and doing quite a lot of addition and summation, but the core data is all theirs, and they are ridiculously, not ridiculously, they are extremely professional and forthright and robust in their data generation. And the census is a real piece of work. It really is. So I think that's where the utility is. But those are my three risks. Sort of, it's missing Wales and Scotland. We can project, by the way, the total population of the UK. It's about 37,000 based on previous studies. But it would be great to have the actual NI and Scottish numbers. And I feel cheated a little bit, but that was a problem. I'm afraid it was the Scottish government's and the Northern Irish government's decision.
Right, thanks, Ben. I'll just remind everyone, if anyone has any questions or even comments, do feel free to pop them in the chat.
Yeah, and do put your videos on, and it'd be great to see you when we do.
Yeah, absolutely. There will be time at the end, although, as I say, do feel free to jump in the middle. Let's touch upon that population point then, Ben, because as you've sort of mentioned yourself, the analysis that we've done or did during the pandemic in particular sort of highlighted the increased respect and recognition of the value of public relations. However, the data appears to suggest, with the caveats that you've already mentioned, that the industry is perhaps smaller than originally viewed, whether that's looking at LinkedIn data, as you've mentioned, or even CIPR State of the Profession data from 2017, 2018, which had it at a bit higher. If nothing else, the data seems to suggest, even with those caveats, that we haven't quite necessarily risen at the rate that we would have maybe expected to. There seems to have been a bit of a
okay, so I think that those two factors are not necessarily logically related. So you're absolutely right, completely right in the sense that as with other post-pandemic or mid-pandemic surveys we undertook because we're responsible for the state of the profession as well. There were some really, they weren't my questions, there were some really smart questions in the SATP last time about respect and reputation of the function, and the conclusions were really clear that there'd been quite a marked increase. And this is really consistent with the literature. A bit of a crisis, PR people suddenly become very valuable. And the internal communications and the ramifications of losing, for instance, face-to-face communications, etc., was a real opportunity. And I mean that, I just mean that in terms of I don't mean that to suggest that it was a good opportunity, but it was something that was presented to public relations functions. Does that necessarily mean that the function then grows and more people are getting employed? Well, no. I don't think that. I don't personally think there's a relationship there. And actually, the literature would suggest that there isn't necessarily a relationship between need and employment. But also, I think there's some factors that work against numbers, which I've hinted at earlier on. Number one is migration post-Brexit, during and post-Brexit of EU-based practitioners. We don't know the impact there, but I can't imagine it was a positive one. But we don't know. We also got to think about the economic impacts of not just Brexit, but all sorts of other economic impacts, which we know have a result in a decline in employment within different sectors, including public relations. But I also think that there are some question marks over, or some differences in methodology that are really important between the different studies. And they are this. Stephen's study, for instance, looked at, I think, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but looked at everybody within the public relations industry. That includes people, for instance, who are finance directors in a PR agency, but aren't actually practitioners, or people in HR functions within an agency who aren't practitioners. So in other words, it was industrial rather than occupational, whereas this is exclusively occupational. The APS study was a bit weird in the sense that I invented the methodology and I really didn't think it was going to work. What we did was we located all the PR practitioners in the APS study, which was only about 550 people in that study. But our working hypothesis was that the ONS sampling was so accurate, so it was so representative, the APS was about 30,000 people every 3 months. The sampling was so good, we could actually use the 550 people in that sample to represent the whole of the PR industry. Now, we didn't think it was necessarily going to work. We did it in 2016, and we tested it by looking at basically whether it was consistent, some of the results with the 2011 census. And lo and behold, they were. And then we did some more analysis, and we found consistency across lots of different data points, which basically suggested that our methodology was pretty good. However, I think that methodology probably overestimated the population of PR practitioners by some, you know, we don't know, but by some proportion. So I think that this might be a more accurate view, if I'm blunt.
Brilliant, very interesting. One of the stats that I think sort of jumped out to me was the one that you highlighted earlier, the 45% of practitioners aged between 16 and 34 were a fairly young industry in terms of the makeup. What do you think this suggests? Is PR a great place to kind of cut your teeth before moving into kind of broader disciplines of management and other areas? Is it a worry? Is it a concern, perhaps, that we are so heavily weighted towards certain age groups?
That's interesting. I think there's more research required on that. We know that there's quite a lot of contemporary research in relation to ageism within all professions, actually, and there's some good news stuff coming out from different people, including the Social Mobility Commission, actually. And I think that's probably a factor to play. It's not exclusive to PR. There's a really good article in the Times actually about that yesterday, about the economic impact of ageism within professionals. Weirdly, ageism is the only discrimination that organisations freely admit to. So a variety of different news studies into this, and there's an advert actually. If you go through Watford Junction Station, there's an advert from an insurance company about this. Essentially, 1 in 5 organisations actively admits to being ageist in its recruiting practices. So there's that. But I also think that there's some studies that suggest that public relations is a stepping stone to other industries as well, and that there becomes a movement into from PR as a profession into, let's say, a broader management a position that might not be classified in the ONS data as public relations.
Yeah, interesting. I think that would be my hunch. I suspect, based on the other research that we've got across the CIPR, that shows the sort of level of stress and working hours done by PR practitioners, I'm sure many of us on the call can relate to. That's a hell of a slog for many years. So perhaps something that people eventually choose to slightly move away from. Just to finish off my questions before we kind of hand it over, and as you say, Ben, it'd be really good to hear from other people as well on some of their reflections on this. I've sort of pointed out one of the pieces of data that I found most revealing and interesting. Is there anything that doing this research, you've done a lot of the state of the profession research for the CIPR, was there anything from this particular research that shocked you as someone that's fairly has their finger on the pulse of what's happening across the industry from that kind of bird's eye perspective? Was there anything new and interesting, alarming, shocking? Was there a wow factor in this report for you?
Yeah, but there's, I mean, these are just personal views. So the stuff on um, the census has got some really interesting questions on. I don't know. So marital status, I thought it's we're not. Most of us aren't married, and the trends on that are really fascinating. They are consistent with the rest of the population, but I thought that I just from a personal point of view, the amount of us, there's 5% of us divorced, 1% are separated but still married. But what I find fascinating about the study overall is it's down to a person. So you can see the exact number of, for instance, members of our community who are followers of the Sikh religion to a person. You can see the exact number of members of our community, of our profession, who are divorced. So I think that for planning of different events, or if you are somebody who works with the industry, well, I'm going to say profession actually, because it's done under occupation. So if you're somebody who works with the profession, I would imagine that some of this data is absolute gold dust, because you're literally identifying down to the very person what your target market is for a particular event. So, but there's loads more we could do with the data there. I mean, this is just scratching the surface. So I think I'd love to compare this against other professions and see where we are and give it some more contextual analysis. But as you and I know, we only had the budget for this one, and it was very kind of the CIPR to sponsor this piece of research.
Right. I see we've got one question, but just while we're getting people thinking about their own questions or comments, I'll just ask quickly one final one. What does this tell us about the future? Can we sort of correctly and adequately draw any conclusions to what this tells us about the future of the profession? Or is it simply a snapshot of a particular era? We accept it as that and move on.
I think to do that, we need to look at the 2011 data. That's a great way of looking at where the trajectory is, by looking at trends over time. And if you would really, really wanted to, you could look at the 10 years before that, whatever, 2001, and do some nice, sexy line graphs showing movement across time. That would be a really nice little study, looking at the different things. One couple of things for anybody interested in doing that. I've got to commend, I'm not saying this because they sponsored the study, but this study would not be possible. No analysis of the PR population or occupation would be possible without CIPR. And the reason for that is because after we started mucking about with the APS data, I got a call from Phil Morgan, who was then Deputy CEO of the CIPR, saying the ONS wants to get rid of the markers for public relations practitioners and merge us with a variety of different occupations. And we fought tooth and nail to keep the markers so that we wouldn't be stymied from doing a study like this in the future. In fact, the CIPR lobbying was so successful that they actually established a separate sectoral occupation classification for PR, because the previous one was muddled in with advertising directors. So I just want to commend CIPR. If I hadn't done that bit of lobbying, none of us would be able to do any of this.
Yeah, small win. We'll take
yeah,
it.
well
Thank
done.
you. Doesn't happen often.
There's a question in here from Alan about SOTP. Interesting you should say that, Alan. Yeah, we're on our next round. So we didn't do one last year, but we're going to do one. We're about to start the process of this one, and we are currently undertaking a review of pretty much every state of the profession study from other professional organisations and membership bodies. And we're looking at kind of where we want to do that, and what questions we want to ask. So yeah, we'll be launching. Please look out for it, everybody. Look out for your survey, which will come to you, all things being equal, in about a month's time.
Yeah, I'll just add a quick note to that, Ben. Thanks a lot. We didn't do state of the profession last year, and that was because we had a sort of feeling that people were slightly surveyed out, a little bit sort of fatigued. I'm sure, as you can all see in your inboxes, there's sort of surveys coming from all organizations and even sort of companies that you shop with, and we were experiencing just fewer and fewer responses to state of the profession. Having said that, the work that we're doing is being really genuinely recognized externally more and more, both by sort of business groups, but also by government departments, particularly the business department that I work with quite closely and regularly. It's often said to us that PR needs its own sort of PR campaign, and that people want the CIPR to advocate on behalf of the profession. And genuinely, the best way that we can do that, and in fact, the only way that we could really do that, is by reflecting people's voices and experiences. And so we appreciate that these surveys do come thick and fast, and it's not the only one that the CIPR asks people to do, and I'm sure there are others across the industry as well. But it genuinely, as Ben's alluded to there in that previous answer, it genuinely does give us the ability to talk genuinely on your behalf about what it is you do, and to be able to actually talk about the importance of this, which is obviously what led us to the fact that we were able to keep the classification in the census in the first place. So thank you for kind of asking that question, Alan. Ben, thanks for the plug. Do keep an eye out for it, and when it does come out, obviously please encourage, well, take the survey and then encourage others to complete it as well, because it's very, very important. Right, we haven't got any questions in the chat, but we would love people, just feel free to come off mute. We haven't got that many of us in the room, so you don't need to put hands up or anything. I would just suggest shouting.
Please, just go on. Any thoughts, questions? Don't be shy, please. Don't be shy.
I'll happy to kick off if you want.
Yeah, please.
Not questions per se, but a few things that the headlines jumped out. Apologies, I only read through it yesterday, kind of ahead of today. The health question I found interesting, where it's kind of, I think the headline's about 94% of people, respondents, were saying they're in good health. Because actually I reflected on the, I can't remember if it's in the mental health one that you run in partnership with the PRCA, where actually we saw 23% of people were reporting sickness because of mental health. And obviously that excludes any other conditions such as physical health. So for me, it's curious there, especially on the wellbeing front, why...
I've got an answer to that, but keep going.
Okay, and that jumped out for me going, oh, actually, this report's saying we're in quite a good health position, where actually people are reporting potentially the opposite in other research. I share I don't know if it's, the concern around that entry-level practitioner, in terms of, I think there's still something we're missing somewhere around how do we better support those that are maybe in their first rung to PR as a wider discipline, and I suppose, who knows, a mix of reasons. I know I was very late joining the membership, and it wasn't until a company sponsored my first year that I then kind of, I suppose, got on that ladder. So I think there's definitely something in there, who knows, price point, accessibility around what stops people taking that jump to go, let's join a membership body and see the value. It'd be interesting, I suppose, from the membership stats to see how many PR student memberships convert to full memberships, and I know last year when I was on the inside, we were trying to look at how do we access colleges, universities to try and get to that entry level. And I'm not just talking, I suppose, age, because actually we can career change later in life, and for me it's that aspect there. So they were the two things that actually jumped out, and I suppose from the headlines, but a really helpful overview, Ben.
To those 2 points, really. Number one is a few things about the health thing. Number one, methodology doesn't half make a difference to the results, and the question doesn't half make a difference to results. You ask people about mental health challenges or stress, for instance, they will give you a very, very different response than if you ask about general health. So specificities. There's a brilliant tweet from Ben Page from Ipsos on how questions change results. And he did it yesterday or the day before. I can't recommend it enough as a great example of how this works. But also, this is a methodological challenge difference as well, in that sense that because it's the day timing, it's 21st of March, it's a question on your health today. So it's not longitudinal. So again, that's going to considerably reduce the proportion of people within it. Also, I think, if I remember rightly in the census, there's a bit of a caveat in that question that sort of teases out, if people say, "Oh, I'm not feeling so great today," it's predisposes towards identifying long-term health issues. Let's put it that way. So I think it's all methodologically explained. I don't think it explains I don't think it points to a difference in practitioners' real world state. And secondly, I think this is a massive opportunity for the CIPR and other. I think that these results present a huge, brilliant opportunity for any membership association, because you've got, you know what your issue is. Your issue is first rung, and you know where you're underrepresented, and there's major opportunities. And I know from running a membership association what the opportunities are in terms of longevity and capturing people at early age, etc. So I would commend this as something CIPR might want to look at. Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you. I can see Stephen and Sam have both put their cameras on. That may suggest they want to ask questions. So Stephen, I'll come to you if you want to.
Yeah. So Ben and I have had a conversation privately about this, and I've written about this, but I'd be really interested in maybe other people in the group have perspectives. But the gender issue really shocked me. I mean, we all know intuitively that there is an issue with women in senior roles, but the number of women leaving the profession, I hadn't appreciated the scale of that. And that's an issue also for men because of the ageism comments that you made, Ben. So that was really interesting to see, and it was actually, it's shocking. We know there's lots of issues. We know this. What can we do you think, to move the dial on this, Ben?
I have some really straightforward suggestions in relation. I've got the data, and then this is what I'm about to say is my personal opinion. So yeah, it's borne out by just looking at the data. This study is ridiculously consistent with the state of profession. Yeah, it's so consistent with the questions that we ask about people who've left the profession and the literature. So I wasn't sadly surprised. What I was surprised by was how bloody clear the drop off is. It's that 30 drop off, which correlates. We can't prove we haven't got any evidence in relation to a causal relationship, but we've got correlative data between essentially childcare and responsibility, having a family, the penalty of motherhood, right? So I think, it's what I'm about to say is not unique or new or anything, but it's, this stuff around part-time provision, not really designing work that can be done part-time, really being having childcare support across the piece, designing work so that it suits especially young mothers. And what we know from the SOTP studies, interestingly enough, I have to say the in-house teams are better at this than agencies. This is particularly pernicious in the agency world about being not taking account of motherhood, bluntly put. Now, it's a sexist world. We should be sharing parental responsibilities as well. So I'm not speaking to that point. And there's much broader social point. But there, I think for me, that would be I mean, they're simple, boring suggestions, but that would be so important, I think. But I'm desperately keen on hearing other people's views on this, because I think it's crucial to a sophisticated professional workforce, because we're losing so much talent.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks, Stephen. Sam,
sorry, just to build on that, the talent drain was the thing that really really surprised me. Just what a complete waste that is. And also, but then, yeah, the interventions. I mean, we've been, this issue has been known for 40 odd years or so, and it's just it needs some sort of radical intervention, I'd suggest. And maybe it's societal, maybe it's a bigger issue. And so looking at professions,
anybody here who's got any connections with, I do, but they're not in this world. They're based in education. They're not into social. But if you've got connections with policymakers in the Labour Party, this would be a conversation to be having with them about it. Because in terms of economic impact, I can't think of relatively straightforward. And it's crazy given the post-pandemic advances in remote working and hybrid working, that we can't make a much bigger inroads into this particular problem, because the wind is behind our sails. And I'm fully aware, of course, I'm a man saying this, so I don't even have the luxury of personal experience. I've got so much privilege that I'm not even aware of.
And with that, I'll shut up.
No, that's great.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Ben.
Really good.
Thanks,
Good
Stephen. Brilliant.
points.
Yeah, and Stephen's LinkedIn article on this piece when he first talked about this study is an absolutely brilliant one-stop shop for this issue. It just sums up the issue brilliantly.
Yeah. I would say that there's a couple of really interesting kind of political conversations happening, and to be fair to all parties, two issues that we've raised today. One, obviously, the issue of childcare. And secondly, the issue of sort of upskilling or reskilling an aging workforce is certainly on the kind of political agenda. Whether or not much is happening is yet to be seen. We've got a question from Kyra in the chat, but I did notice that Sam had put himself on camera. Sam, I don't know if you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, Sam and Kyra, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So kind of builds on the conversation you were having with Stephen there, which I think is a really, really important one. I know there's a few things that came to mind when you were presenting and when you were talking just there. I think there is definitely something about a wider issue in society about what flexible working looks like and what is it that employers need to be giving to their employees to enable them to remain in the workforce across different stages in life, and kind of recognizing that, you know, if you don't do that, you do lose that talent, that knowledge, that expertise, and that productivity. And I think there's definitely some value in thinking about what a membership body can do to lead a conversation around that for our profession as well. So we think about what a working offer looks like for different people at different stages of their life, for example, and not think that people need to work at the same pace, at the same capacity across the entirety of their working life. I think that could be really important. I think the other point you made around upskilling is really important. So I'm one of the co-chairs of CIPR's health group, and one of the conversations we've been having recently is about recognizing how PR as a profession has changed so radically over the last few decades, and the kind of roles and the kind of activities you might be delivering now look very different to what a PR professional might have been delivering 30 years ago. So there's a bit of a concern that we've seen people drop out of the profession because our professional practice has moved forward, but those people haven't necessarily had the support to upskill in a way that allows them to remain in the profession and feel like they're able to deliver effective work against a different type of activity. So I think there's something about what we could be doing more in CIPR to offer that view of how PR as a profession is changing and bringing in different types of activity and different types of specialisms over time. I know we've done some great work around AI, for example, but I think there are other areas we could be thinking about as well in that space.
Well, I think that's a great point. Sorry, interrupt. Go on.
No. I guess the last thing I was going to say, I think what I'm particularly interested in knowing if this can do to that kind of wider question is there something this can link into the State of the Profession survey to try and map that change in kind of map of the profession over time. I think there's a really interesting bit of work that kind of shows these are the kind of things people are doing under the PR umbrella at this point, and seeing how that changes over time. And there's a role for a membership body, I think, in really mapping that out. I know people like GCS attempt to do that for the civil service, for example, but of course the profession is much wider than that. And I wonder if there's a piece of work that could grow out of this that looks to do that.
Well, it will. Bluntly put. So the challenge with the SOTP is it's not a census. It's a slice of people who will respond, who are. It's selective because it's the CIPR membership. So you select whether it's not, so it's not the whole of the PR profession. It's not even all of the membership bodies, because there's another one, if not more. It's certainly not all of the CIPR. It's about anything between 700 to about 500, actually 550 some years, to about 1,250. So it's a slice. But that is sufficient as a sample to give us all sorts of information about, particularly about the day job, what the day job looks like. If we want to know more about the population per se in large, we need to look at stuff like this: the ONS, the APS, labour force survey, business hours index studies, etc. So we actually need to collate lots of different information. But what the state of the profession does really, really well is it looks at what we do as practitioners and how our day looks. And what we do, it's quite, we think about it a lot. So we use the global framework actually to think about tasks and activities. And we've been mapping that since 2011, I think. So we've got data, we've got some of the same questions over time, very few. We've kept very few because there's no good argument for keeping questions for that long. But we've got trends data across time about, you know, what does the day job look like, which is hugely useful. So yeah, I'm on completely the same page. Can I just speak to some points made in the chat? Actually,
yes, please, thank you.
Sarah asked this brilliant question about how do we the questions are just determined by what's in the census. So these are just the bog standard census questions. Are you married? How old are you? Are you religious? Oh, you are. What's your religion? Do you have a second home? That stuff. So I think it's about the 25 key questions in the census. And then they're sliced and diced, basically. And what we do is we just pick out all the people that answered either code 1123 or 2496, I think it is, basically, that said they are PR practitioners when they said, what do you do for a living? So again, there's a challenge there. Anybody, by the way, who works in PR, but they say they work in marketing, they are discounted from our study. So again, that does have I didn't mention it earlier, but that does have an impact on numbers. That's another reason why the population is underreported. But how can you recreate it more usefully? Get this study, and there are loads of questions in this study, I think, that you could use and you could just, you know, use at work. So look, the average in terms of we're a big team or a big organization or an agency, the benchmark for ethnic diversity is X. We want to be more diverse than the standard across the industry. We want to make sure that what the benchmark in relation to women in senior posts is X. So you could there's loads of different benchmarks available here. I mean, I wouldn't want to benchmark how many of you have a second home, but crack on if you like. But you know, yeah. So I think there's stuff in here that anybody can use to benchmark and plan ahead. So go look. We know we've got a massive proportion of population that are actually potentially 16 to 45, and we've got 34, and we've got 3 of those. So, you know, based on the national studies, we really need to be growing our younger workforce, and we can because we know the pool's out there. So there's all sorts of ways in which, and Dan's suggestion here about working group around it, you know, I think a next step for this kind of study is for people like your good selves to sort of work out whichever way you want to do it. How would you apply this practically, this beyond what I've just come off the top of my head? Because I can think of off the top of my head a lot of ways in which to practically use this information if I was doing workforce planning for a PR agency or an in-house team that was big enough to do some planning for. And the other thing I'd say is Claire Foster, which is brilliant. I mean, Claire, you know, you've got more solutions is on the call. You've got more solutions to the problems that I've highlighted than I'll ever know, and you've thought and written, your group has, about this in much more detail than I ever will. So, you know, I don't want to reinvent the wheel here. You know, Global Women in PR, for instance, have done a lot of work on this issue, the gender issue. So I just want to, you know, the stuff I'm saying is probably stolen from them in the first place.
I just wanted to flag, because I think it's so important that people do understand these issues, and I think you've given the issues brought it to a wider audience, but pretty much everything that you've said today is exactly what we've seen and what we've been talking about for a long time. And it is, I mean, as a mother of a young son, I was paying £1,900 a month on nursery fees. Even now he's just started school. I've got, you know, 6 weeks of summer holidays to fill, half terms, inset days, and I think a lot of companies, I would say, we posted an article this week actually on LinkedIn on fake flexibility. I think a lot of people think that they offer flexibility, and they don't. It's quite an interesting trend at the moment, but definitely childcare is prohibiting a lot of career development for women.
Thanks, Claire. I mean, sorry, that's so depressing. But you know, it's so punitive, isn't it? And so silly because socially, because of all that lost talent. But thanks for speaking to that. I'll go and have a look at that article as well. But yeah, I think people like groups like your good self have already, you know what the answers are, and some of them, of course, as you suggested in that last set of comments, are perhaps beyond the ken of public relations as an industry / profession. They're much broader stuff. Paul's got his video.
Certainly feel your pain, Claire, on the childcare point. And I think there was there's a really interesting point here made, which is that this data hasn't necessarily entirely told us things that we didn't already know, but a lot of it has been qualified and sort of obviously quantified as well with the data against it. Just in terms of next steps, and I can see Paul's also taking his put his camera on, so Paul, I'll come to you in a second. A lot of really good points here, and Dan's obviously made a good point. We've talked a lot about sort of next steps. I will be talking to our council about these findings and talking about what the CIPR does next in terms of some of these. Obviously, there's a lot of these things that we're doing, and then groups, Stephen's socio-mobile group and lots of other groups are doing in certain areas to try and address some of the issues of diversity and accessibility and longevity in the industry. But the CIPR certainly is taking this data and genuinely thinking about what it tells us and ways that we can help. And we would certainly encourage anyone on this call and anyone watching the recording later to get in touch and feel free to share their experiences and suggestions as well. So
put applications into the research fund.
And apply for the research fund as well. Thank you, Ben. Paul, did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, kind of both, I suppose. I found the findings were absolutely fascinating, and the one that really stood out for me was that 45% figure showing practitioners aged between 16 and 34. That surprised me. I didn't realize that 55% of the profession are aged 35 and older, which kind of really accentuates the point about the lack of diversity, really, in terms of what we are doing as an industry to retain women in particular, who there was a piece of research about a year or so ago, and I did a comment on PR Moment for it, talking about the number of women that when they get to 50, they're not sure they're going to be able to continue in the profession because the support mechanisms aren't there. But I was kind of particularly fascinated at the other end of the age scale in terms of that 16 to 34 number. And I wonder how many of those are graduates. And are we still, as an industry, really looking for those who have been to university when I didn't complete my degree. I'm actually the only person in my agency who doesn't have a degree, and every single person I've always hired has had a degree. And it's only been recently I've started thinking, why? I don't really know why. But how many of that 16 to 34 number have a degree or don't have a degree? And how many are actually under the age of 21, i.e. school leavers, college leavers, those who opted to go into the workplace? And isn't that a real missed opportunity when one of the biggest topics of discussion whenever agency heads get together is that of recruitment and the talent pipeline and the difficulties in finding people? Are we just relying very heavily on, here's a job that we need filling in the here and now, let's put some advertising out there and get that filled? Or are we missing a trick here by not looking at the future talent pipeline and thinking, well, maybe we do need to have more schemes, apprenticeship schemes, school leaver schemes, go into schools and colleges and actually promote what PR is all about. It's not all the sexy stuff that you see, all the shit stuff you see floating down the Thames. Is actually some really cool stuff that you can do. Someone said earlier, maybe we're not doing as good a PR job on ourselves as an industry. And I think the younger age group, they're the future of the industry, as cliches and corny as they are, as that sounds, but they very much are. And I feel like we're not really tapping into that really great pool of enthusiastic talent that we could be doing.
So Paul, that was a bit like my head, right? Just a thought, just basically my views just coming out and moving into somebody else's head.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not
Your
quite sure.
feelings are, you are utterly and completely correct. And on this, I can speak with some authority, more than anything I've said in the last hour. I'm going to be quick because I know we've all got to go. So I'll talk for about a minute, right? You are utterly and totally correct, because obviously my other part of my job is analyzing education and qualification data. And the apprenticeship numbers in public relations, as indicated by this research and others, is absolutely woeful. And the ongoing requirement for a level 4 to level 6 qualification, or level 6 qualification, in other words, a degree, amongst public relations agencies is utterly, utterly ridiculous. It is nonsensical, but unfortunately, it is an ongoing. Essentially, it's nothing more than a combination of it's a lazy trend, a bit of snobbery, and a little bit of and a massive amount of status quo bias. And if I was going to wave a magic wand to change anything, it would be to do exactly what you're suggesting you do, which is think a little bit outside the box in terms of qualification, desirability, and skills levels against, whether going for skills and experience versus qualification, etc. Growing our own and developing a very different approach to qualification requirements in the pipeline, because as this data shows, the proportion of professionals, those at the younger age group, is the proportion of apprentices in that group is no bigger than in the senior group, which means we have not progressed proportionally at all when it comes to non-degree provision. So have a look at the table. It's on page, I think it's page 27. It's woeful in the report. We didn't look at age, but we don't need to, if I'm honest, because it's pretty, we know from that nothing has changed. And if you look at the industrial data I've gone over a minute, if you look at the data, so we do analysis based on job adverts. So we have a tool produced by Lightcast, also by people called MC, it's brilliant. And it looks at what skills, experience, and qualifications are required in all job adverts for any position in any given geography. And I've got free access to it, right? And so I muck about with the public relations industry in relation to this. And guess what? The adverts are no different now than they were 10 years ago. And when we ask the SOTP question in a month's time, what's your most common activity? 82 to 85% will still say copywriting, just like they did in 2011. And I'll leave you with that. So there's a skill that I would put money on it. So again, there's a broader issue about jobs as well, about junior level jobs expectancies and when we push people, etc. But there's you absolutely nail it on the head, and there's so much that could be done in relation to alternative qualification routes.
Excellent. Alan's put in a nice comment there at the end as well. Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you for that point. Please do follow up. I think you should have had an email from me earlier today as a registrant for this event. Can I just first of all thank you all for taking the time? We're bang on time, for sticking with us for the hour, and for your very interesting comments and contributions, and just for sort of sticking around and listening. And please, I'm sure we'll all like to thank Ben as well for showing his expertise and thoughts. I thought it was a really interesting conversation. The report's there for everyone to download and read. And as Ben and myself have alluded to, keep the conversation going. It doesn't stop here. This is just the beginning. Thank you all very much. The recording will be available soon to watch back. And thank you again, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Cheers. Thanks, Paul. Great question. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, John. Gotta go. See you soon.